So now we know how to create and apply materials. Let's look at how we can manipulate the materials when they're actually placed on objects. When you create a material and just drop it onto an object, we know that it's projected, and the default is UVW mapping, and the UVs are coordinates. And to make this a bit easier to visualize, let's grab a UV grid. We head over to hellolux.com and you can download the files and save them to place on your hard drive, and then we can both use them together. So you can just click this link and download the files. So with our material that we've just created, let's open it up, and in the color field in this texture, we're going to load in that UV grid. I've got mine on the desktop, so I'm just going to click on this large grid and we'll have a quick look. And I'm just going to say no. And if we close this material editor down, we can now see, if I just hide these, this is a representation of the UV coordinates. So U goes across the bottom and V across the top. And anything positioned in this space will be applied to an object. Essentially, think about this as a piece of paper that gets wrapped around the object. That's why it's called UV wrapping and UV unwrapping. So we'll look at some of the objects and we can sort of visualize this a bit better. We'll just enable these again. So let's drop it onto the sphere first. You can see now that material is being wrapped onto the sphere. It's using this UV mapping by default. But if we change it to one of the different projection types, maybe spherical, and what we need to do is to enable our texture tool, go into texture mode. If we just click on that object, you can see now that the UV's being wrapped around. So we've got our start point there, which is 0, 0. And that's wrapping around to this point here, 1, 0. Now, if we can manipulate this a bit easier with the texture axis, we can enable this on, and now we can rotate it around. We can scale. Doesn't really have an effect on this object, but we can see it happening just here. Now we can just scale this. Just undo a few steps. And if we go into the texture as well, we can change the length of it, and you can see if I turn off tiling, we'll get a sense of the wrapping around the object. So it's only 17% wrapped. So if we just wrap this all the way around, and that is what it's essentially doing. So let's come and have a look at some of the others. We can just drag the material onto the cube, and we'll drag it onto cone as well. And you get this grid in the viewport, and when we move the camera, we can't really manipulate this either with our texture tool because the UV coordinates are just absolutely locked. So that's why they're good to have, because you know that if I texture something this way, I'll just turn this off for now, then I move my camera, or I move the object in fact, then the texture will be locked on to that point and those coordinates on the object. So if we look at the cube and we'll change it to maybe cubic mapping, nothing changes. You can see that's a kind of appropriate mapping for this kind of object if you didn't have any UVs. So if you don't have the axis tool turned on and you try and move the texture around, you get this weird kind of things go off in different directions, and I find it not too intuitive. So that's why it's useful just to turn this on, and then you can actually move. If I grab the handle, you can move the texture as a whole, and you can see we can definitely offset this, rotate it. Now, if you ever want to get back to where you were, you could just right click and choose fit to object. And it's actually now, because of the rotation, it's going to encompass that whole object so it can fit the texture on. If we come into the material in the coordinates and remove that rotation and then right click and choose fit to object, it should snap back, and it does, to where it is. So we've got this other object, a cone, and if we change the mapping on that one to something like cylindrical, if we just toggle back, yeah, nothing really changes. So you can see that's the sort of appropriate mapping for that kind of object as well, if we didn't have any UVs, like I said before. And there's various other ones as well. Come over to the cube and change the mapping to flat. Now let's look at that. You can see that we're not getting anything on the sides. It's just this plane that is just projecting all the way through. And you can see that the lines are just being stretched across. So we can, again, rotate that. And then we can sort of move it around. And you could think of maybe this is how you'd add decals or something like that to an object. So we could take a look at that in a little while. And another one, which is quite useful, got this frontal mapping. You can see as we move around, texture's moving with that. Camera mapping is quite interesting because if you have a camera in the scene, and this brings home the point of projections really, if we've got a camera in the scene and we can just put the camera into the field here and just calculate it, so we've got the same aspect ratio. This is our camera, and if we look around with that, you can see the texture moving on it. So we could get it to the point that we like, come out of the camera, and you can see that's locked into position. That texture is being projected onto that geometry through that camera. So that's a good visual. So I mentioned those decals before. Let's bring in a new material and we'll, as before, bring in a texture. If you come to your exercise files and bring in the logo that we have here, we need an alpha channel. So we can just enable that channel. And a quick tip to move one shader to another is to just drag it and come over and then drop it. So that saves the palaver of right-clicking and copying and pasting and all that. You can just do it like so. So let's just hide some of these objects here. We don't need them anymore for now. So, and we'll delete that camera. Let's drop the image onto this plane and have a look at it. And I just want to point out a common problem as well when you're working with Photoshop files in particular with an alpha channel and they're not set up correctly. And you can see we've got this white fringing. That is because, well, I know I saved this file with the maximize compatibility option on in Photoshop. And if we come over to Photoshop, you can see essentially what that does is it says, I am going to save it out a flattened version of this. So even though you've got the alpha channel, you've got this white matting as well. So what you want to do is make sure that you just choose the logo. And when we render, we've removed that matting. So very easy mistake to make. And now let's just remove that. We'll bring our cube back. In fact, I'm going to create a new object. So let's create one of these, an oil tank, and we'll just move it up. Come into object mode, just move it up a bit here. And I'll make a new material and drop that on. And then I'll drop on our logo. And you can see this looks absolutely terrible. This would not be a good looking projection. So maybe we can change the type to one that we've been discussing. So maybe flat would be an interesting one for decals. And let's just come into our texture axis mode and we can start to manipulate this. Maybe we just need to rotate it. And let's get it so that it's sitting on top of that oil tank. And there we go. So now we've looked at manipulating materials on objects using the different projection types and the texture mode tools.